Okay, is this little watercolor experiment thing gonna end up looking anything at all like Joyce Carol Oates? Almost certainly not. But I'm gonna draw Joyce Carol Oates today because she's been on my mind a lot. I've been binging her work for the past 3 weeks or so, but I also feel a weird kind of apprehension, and it has come up every time since college that I've tried to do a deep dive into her work. And it reminds me of how, like in high school and college, and for an embarrassing amount of time after college, I was very easily seduced by the mystique of a given writer. Like when I was 16, for instance, and I cringe to remember it, but I had heard Norman Mailer appear on KCRW's Bookworm, and I had watched his American Masters documentary, and so at the age of 16, I felt no compunction about saying, like, Norman Mailer is my favorite writer. And at no point did it seem weird to me that I had never actually been able to finish one of the books by this dude who was ostensibly my favorite writer. Although, I did just think that the only reason I couldn't finish Norman Mailer books is not because they were boring, but because I was stupid and I wasn't getting it. And I was, back then, of the impression, and now I think it's the wrong impression, that it was always the responsibility of the reader to rise to the level of the author, as opposed to vice versa. Just in general, though, I do tend to pay too much attention to authors when I'm reading their work, and one of the things about Joyce Carol Oates that I know I give way too much attention is just this idea of the volume of her output, and it lends to this kind of Netflix doom-scrolling type of experience where I spend so much more time trying to pick out the Joyce Carol Oates book that I want to read than I spend actually reading. Like, I'll go online, for instance, and I will see that Joyce Carol Oates has 200 books to her credit, and as soon as I see that, I think, okay, but which ones are the best books? Which the comedian Aziz Ansari talked about in one of his routines. He talks about losing his toothbrush, and so he went to buy a toothbrush, and while he was in CVS, standing in front of the display of toothbrushes, he pulled out his phone and he went on Google and he typed in, which brand is the best toothbrush? And then after that, he started asking himself, why do I need the best toothbrush? And I can say the same thing here. Why do I only need the best books by Joyce Carol Oates? And honestly, the more I think about it, the more I think of it as a kind of laziness. Because by saying that I only want the best books, it's kind of like I'm saying, show me the books whose pleasures are right there on the surface for me to find. That way, I don't have to do any kind of digging as a reader in order to find the more complicated kinds of literary value. And the same might be said of Aziz Ansari with the toothbrush thing. The reason we want the very best and most efficient toothbrush is because, in reality, the efficacy of a toothbrush is predicated entirely on the consistency of the brusher. And if we buy a super duper efficient and powerful and bacteria vanquishing toothbrush, it helps to ease some of the accountability off of our plates. Because now, rather than saying, oh, I need to brush 3 times a day in order to make sure I don't have any cavities, now that I bought this device, I only have to brush my teeth once a day because my toothbrushing experience is the equivalent of like filleting an Uzi. And it feeds into this other personal habit of mine, which is I think I have this very ugly habit of collecting authors, rampaging through an author's entire body of work and reading over the course of like 6 months what took them 40 years to write. And I really do think it's an insecurity thing. Like, I'm trying to consume the author and all of their talent so that, having gorged on everything they ever put out, I can see the repetitions, I can see the little techniques that they lean on in an effort to conceal some shortcoming. In a sprint in the last couple months of 2021, I read James Ellroy's 11 most recent novels. And I was doing the same thing. I only discovered his work back in October, and I was so dazzled by the complexity and the brilliance of Black Dahlia and American Tabloid that I started racing through his entire body of work because I wanted to see the folly. I wanted to see the repetitions, almost as though to remind myself that this authorial entity that seems so transcendent, don't worry, he's only human. And I think that's part of the reason why, although I've read some of her longer fictions like Blonde and Breathe and Patricide, I tend to stick to the short stories and to the essays, because that way I can read a great many of them in a pretty modest amount of time, and then on the basis of having consumed so many individual units, I can give myself a better idea of what this author is about. And it feels so toxic, but the older I get, and I don't know if this was college or what, but I seem way more hell-bent on trying to grasp the idea of what a writer is all about as an individual, rather than just pick up a book and enjoy it. It's an adversarial kind of reading. I do it all the time. I resent that I do it. And it seems like such insecurity as a reader that I battle off this idea of a book as like a singular, enveloping, transcendent experience. And yet that's entirely how I engaged with books when I was a kid. When I first fell in love with reading, each book was its own magical thing, and I could read it and reread it without ever looking at it as like a constellation or a composite of literary attitudes and styles and techniques. That kind of free-form, self-contained childhood reading seems like a kind of intellectual and emotional surrender now that I'm an adult looking back on it, and I think it's interesting and kinda sad to find myself afraid of it. Hey guys, thank you for watching my terrible drawing video. If you would like for me to send you whatever you saw today, just let me know. There's an email address down in the description. It's thousandmovieproject@gmail.com. Just send me your mailing address and I will make sure to get it out to you, unless someone else has already requested it, which is really unlikely. But in the event that you do want that particular sheet and I don't have it, I will send you something else. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.